Welcome back to CG Figures. Today I'm going to be showing how to animate a macro to micro transition combining object and material animation. The specific case study for this is something someone requested, namely the transition of a human hair at a macro scale, something you could see with your eye, into something more micro or nanoscale. In this case, it's an SEM image of a human hair that I created in a previous tutorial. If you're interested, I'll put the link in the description. One of the things that I'll say right away for this is that I'm going to do all my animation Eevee. If your computer is not a powerhouse, then cycles will take a little bit of time to render. Eevee will be significantly faster most of the time, and I'll put up numbers at the end to showcase just how long each frame would take on the two different render engines. We'll start by animating the object. To do this, simply hit I and add in the type of keyframe that you want. I'm going to go with scaling. Then I'll jump ahead X number of frames that I want. I want this to be about a 3-second animation, and I'm going to use 24 frames per second, so this will be 72 frames. From here, I'm simply going to hit S, Shift-C, and then Shift-C again because I've rotated this object and I need to work in local coordinates, and I'll drag this in so that it's much more narrow. Something like this will be fine. Because these edges are off camera, I don't have to worry about them. Now obviously you can see that this just makes the texture look quite poor, but we're going to fix this by using a material transition in conjunction with the object. First though, we have to grab our object, hit I again, and apply a scaling keyframe. So this is actually going in the wrong direction. If we were to reset the timeline here and press play, you'll see that this is shrinking in. We want it to go the other way. We want to go from the smaller macro shot of the human hair, zooming in. So very simply, the way that I'm going to fix this is I'm just going to come down this little animation bar, grab this little yellow diamond. If it's yellow, it's the only one selected. And so I can just move this and I'll move it back towards 0. Then I'll grab my 0 keyframe and move it to the point that I was at on frame 75, or 72 rather. So I'll move this to 0, and now resetting my timeline, you can see I have my small skinny hair. I'll press play, and then this will zoom in to our final transition. The way that we're going to affect this transition at the same time with materials is very simple. We'll open a new window, we'll come to the shader editor, and all of this up here is just to create the texture of the human hair. We don't have to worry about that right now. The transition animation is actually very simple for materials. We're going to simply hit Shift-A, and I'll add in a diffuse BSDF. I'll make this dark. We'll use a black hair. And then with Node Wrangler enabled, so Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and Node Wrangler, I can select my diffuse BSDF, shift and grab my mix shader down here, and Control 0 on the number pad to create another mixed shader. And if we zoom in on the viewport, you can see what this little slider for the factor does. If I go all the way to 0, it goes all the way to the black texture. If I go all the way to 1, it goes all the way to this other texture, creating the SEM zoom in. So very, very simply, on frame 1 in my timeline, I'm going to change the factor to 0 so that it's dark, and I'll right-click on the factor and insert keyframe. I'll then come to frame 72, and I'll change this factor to 1 and insert a keyframe there as well. In fact, you can see I've missed here that these two keyframes are not perfectly aligned. That's actually going to be okay. It's still going to look fine. So if we reset the timeline, you can see we have this dark hair. It actually still has some small amount of texture because of the displacement from the previous setup, which is nice. But if we simply press play, it's going to stretch out and zoom in and give us this final texture that we want. Now, this mixed shader technique can be used to chain multiple materials together. So if I wanted to have various points in the timeline where it changes from a black one to a brown one or something like that, I could actually animate it here by just changing the color, and you can add keyframes to these aspects of the shader. But then I could also just add multiple mix shaders to cycle between different textures if I wanted to do that. And that's really all there is to this animation. It's very simple. If you wanted to do something a little bit more involved by having multiple hairs and then having some of them fade away, you can do that again with animated transitions, primarily with materials, but also with scaling effects. Those are a little bit more in-depth, and I'm not going to get into them in this video. If you want to see more work on animation and some of the controls that Blender offers in a more comprehensive way, I was originally planning to do that, but I will instead defer that to the fantastic tutorials of Derek Elliot of Dirk.com. His work is, frankly speaking, fantastic. He has a really good way of showing all of this transition stuff. I cannot recommend Derek's work highly enough, so if you're interested in learning more about some of the nitty-gritty details of animation, absolutely check out his channel. I decided I was actually finished the video and that I would put together a thumbnail, but I wanted to add in some of the details that I sort of overlooked and then discuss what extra changes I made. Animation is really, in my mind, a lot about little details, and adding in extra features usually tends to show what you're trying to achieve a little bit better. So you can see here, this looks a little bit more interesting than just a simple tube. All I did to achieve this effect was, in the original model, I have quite a lot of cuts along the actual cylinder, so I have a good bit of geometry. I added a displacement modifier using a clouds texture with the direction set to Y and the texture coordinates being local. The texture is just set up as a basic clouds with a size of 1.5. And I also animated this. So you can see that I started off with an initial very high strength, and then at 60 frames in, I dropped the strength to 0. So if I press play here, you can see what's actually going to happen, and this frame rate is quite low. That's something I'm going to talk about in a moment. You can see it's actually going to bring that transition in. You can see the material start to form. This is going to line up as it goes, and the transition for the strength comes down to 0. But this is actually just something that I think makes for a little bit of a better animation on the whole. Now, one thing that I forgot to discuss in the original recording was all the actual setup for finishing the animation. There are a few things that I want to note. First was that frame rate. You can see how slow this is right now. So that's about 4 frames per second on average. That means that if I go ahead and actually do this animation at 24 frames per second, it's obviously going to be much, much faster in the final outcome. So don't let the viewport sort of deceive you into thinking this is what you're going to get. If that number is not sufficiently high, that's not what you're going to see. If we change to a solid view, we might actually have a little bit of a better visualization of that. We'll see what frame rate we get. Still not great, a little twice as fast, but in reality, this will be much, much faster. It's only going to be 3 seconds for the whole effect, so just keep that in mind. In terms of the actual animation setup, you simply come to the Output Properties tab. All of these are fine. I'm going to choose a directory that I want, namely the directory for this tutorial. And this is where you would set up everything for the animation. So I'm going to start at frame 1, end at frame 96. I actually usually like to add another second or so. So even though all of the transitions occur by frame 72, I want the viewer to have another second to sort of catch up with what happened. You don't want to end abruptly. Then from all of the other settings, I'm going to come to output, and for file format, I'll change from PNG to FFmpeg video. For the encoding, I almost always go with MP4. For output quality, I'll usually go with perceptually lossless or high quality. It doesn't matter. And then very, very significant, again, I mentioned before that I do everything in Eevee. I'll showcase right after this what the two numbers are for cycles in Eevee. I'll just throw them up on the screen. But one of the things that I'll almost always do for an animation is I'll first just render a still frame. So if we just hit F12, this is going to render in Eevee, and we'll get a sense of how long it takes to render. So you can see for an individual frame, this takes 3.5 seconds to render. That's pretty good. If you wanted to, I find for Eevee, you can really get away with changing things. So you'll see this sampling option for render. If I cut that in half and then render this again, 2 seconds. That might not seem like a lot, but again, 1 second for 96 frames, that will add up, especially if these are longer numbers, and sometimes they really are. So if you can drop 10 seconds to 5 seconds, and I've absolutely done that, I usually do, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference in the quality here. If you really need this to be very, very good, you're going to have to render it in cycles anyway, and each frame is probably going to take a few minutes. So again, I'll throw that number up, but those are the actual settings for the animation. If you have everything set up, then all you would do is simply go to render animation, and then it would be done. With that, thanks for coming out. If you found this interesting, consider subscribing, sharing with your friends and colleagues. Let me know in the comments if there's something else specific that you'd like to see. And until next time, you have yourselves a great old day.